So our first speaker is Pat Reynolds, Honorary Research Associate at the University of Sydney and convener at AFTINET. He'll be giving an overview on the Trump trade policies and of the AFTINET election scorecard, which assesses parties' political policies on key trade justice areas.
Thanks very much. Okay, so I'm going to start off by talking about what the current rules are. So the current neoliberal trade rules are that each country should produce only what it can make at least cost and import everything else at zero or minimal regulation, zero tariffs and minimal regulation. The World Trade Organization and other trade agreement rules agree to reduce tariffs, not raise them, and some minimise other government regulation that's seen as trade barriers. And there are some minimal rules for industry development needs of low-income countries. So what these rules basically do is maximise international trade and investment for global corporations. Some trade deals even have increased legal rights for corporations, like rights to sue governments over policy changes, investor-state dispute settlement, and you might remember that the Philip Morris tobacco company sued Australia over our tobacco plain packaging law, and Clive Palmer is currently suing the government, pretending to be or claiming to be a Singaporean investor and suing over the refusal of a coal mine licence for billions of dollars. Also, things like stronger medicine monopolies favour corporate interests. So there's a strong corporate interest in influence on the current trade rules, but the community is largely excluded and trade deals remain secret until after they're signed. And what this framework does is it does ignore the unequal local and global impacts on jobs and communities and the environment. Most deals don't have enforceable labour rights or environmental standards. But the COVID pandemic disruptions to supply chains and the global climate crisis have exposed the flaws in this system. So many governments now recognise the need for active policies to support local production of essential products and to support the transition to a low carbon economy. Although Trump's support is partly a reaction to the shortcomings of the neoliberal trade framework, his increased tariffs are not the answer, and they'll actually worsen existing inequalities. So what are these policies? The America First policies mean that the US should completely dominate global trade. It favours pro-Trump corporates like fossil fuels, big tech, pharmaceuticals, as well as corporates in general, and it will harm workers, consumers, and the environment. It also rejects other international agreements in its broader policy, like the Paris Climate Change, World Health Organization, and UN human rights agreements. So the basic aim is to collect government revenue through tariffs paid to government and to use this to fund corporate tax cuts and protect US industries. But importers will pass on these price rises to consumers, causing US inflation. If other countries retaliate, tariff wars will increase inflation, slow economic growth, and could possibly cause global recession, with the worst impacts for low-income countries. We've already seen that stock and bond markets have been hit, forcing Trump to pause the latest higher tariffs and implement his 10% base rate on all countries, except for some higher rates for Canada, Mexico, the EU, and even higher for China. And of course, just in the last couple of days, they hurriedly made exemptions for iPhone and other tech products imported into the US because it would have damaged their favoured tech industry cronies. So basically, what this does is maximise trade pressure and military pressure on China. I can't talk too much about the global geopolitics with China, but because of time, but I'm happy to answer questions about that. And this is really a weaponization of tariffs. So the latest round of what they call reciprocal tariffs, they're claiming that they're tariffs reciprocating for those countries who have trade surpluses and high tariffs on US imports. But the way that it's been formulated, which is very crude, is that there are higher tariffs on many allies and many developing countries. These have now been paused at 10% until early July, and Trump hopes that governments will then negotiate away some of what he calls trade barriers. There's also specific industry tariffs, 25% on steel and aluminium, specific auto tariffs, some exemptions on those, and threats of pharmaceutical tariffs. So what these basically do is maximise threats and then delay them to coerce concessions from others. And there's a lot of chaos and confusion with changes and delays. And there's now open conflict between Trump's advisors, e.g. Musk versus the others. So the US has also targeted Australian national policies like biosecurity rules for food imports, our media bargaining code, Australian content rules in media, and the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. So what it's doing here is using tariffs to force countries to change their public interest regulation to suit US industries like agribusiness, fossil fuel, and big tech companies. And of course, they're also using threats of territorial expansion, tariffs in a threat of territorial expansion to Canada, Greenland, and Panama. Now, if we look at the impacts in Australia, so Australia has a trade deficit with the US, not a surplus. We export less to the US than they do to us. And it also already has zero tariffs on US imports, but we've still been hit by these, what they call tariffs applied to all countries, the 10%, and the 25% steel and aluminium tariffs, and maybe by pharmaceutical tariffs. Now, US exports are only 5% of Australia's total exports, so the direct effects will be on those industries, and I'm sure Steve's going to talk about that. But we'll also be talking about and hit by negative impacts on our big trading partners, China, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, and the EU. And we've already seen the kind of financial market instability, and there's talk of a possible global recession. Now, the government response to that has been to say they will have some funding for affected industries. They'll have some preference, more preference to local companies and government purchasing, stronger anti-dumping policies to prevent dumping of products at less than their cost of production, which is a traditional thing in trade rules, and work with other countries to further diversify exports to countries other than the US. They are also saying they'll lodge a dispute against WTO rules, which will enable some scrutiny of the US tariffs, but it won't result in any penalties because the US has blocked appointments to the WTO disputes appeal system. So the US is still a member of the WTO, but it's flouting the rules. So our history as a fair trade and trade justice organisation has been to develop fair trade alternatives to both the extremes of neoliberal regime and to these kinds of policies proposed by Trump. So Trump basically wants to replace the neoliberal multilateral trade rules with total domination from the US and trade wars with China and others. And I've tried to outline briefly the negative impacts that this would have. We need to take this opportunity to insist on the key principles for a fairer and more transparent multilateral trade system, which includes all countries. And some of the key issues for this are, first of all, to end secrecy, to have more transparency and democratic accountability at national and international trade agreements, exclude harmful provisions like investor rights to sue governments or ISDS and medicine monopolies, to have both trade and balanced industry development, and have commitments to human rights, labour rights, and environmental sustainability, including carbon emissions, a reduction of carbon emissions. So we also need to recognise the specific development needs of low-income countries. So our elections policy scorecard compares the parliamentary parties' policies on key trade justice issues in policy statements and voting records. So I'll just go through the scorecard. The first issue is about transparency. The Labor government had a parliamentary inquiry into the trade agreement process and the content of trade agreements, which recommended that there should be legislation for a more transparent process and to exclude harmful content from trade agreements. If we look at the Liberal National policy on that, they haven't made any statements supporting that. The other three parties, Labor, the Greens, and the Jackie Lambie network, have all supported the idea of legislating in those areas. On foreign investor rights to sue governments, the LNP actually supports foreign investor rights to sue governments. Their Shadow Trade Minister has made statements in support of it. The other three parties oppose it. Supporting enforceable labour rights and environmental standards in trade agreements, including net zero emissions targets. The Liberal National Party has only supported this in some agreements where other trade partners have insisted on it. Labor has a policy which says that it will support these enforceable rights in all trade agreements, but the enforceability has varied. So in the EU negotiations at the moment, they're supporting fully enforceable labour rights and environmental standards. But in the agreement with the United Arab Emirates, which has a poor record, very poor record in these areas, it didn't support full enforceability. And the other two parties have supported these things in principle. On local industry policies, the Liberals have said that they don't support what they call picking winners, and they didn't support the Future Made in Australia legislation. The other three parties do support that. Supporting strong anti-dumping policies, Liberals have said they will support those in the context of the Trump tariffs, and the other three parties have supported them. And on independent evaluation of trade agreements and releasing the final texts of trade agreements before they're signed, again, the Liberals haven't made any recent statements on this, but they opposed it when they were in office. The other three parties support it. So if you summarise the scores, the Liberals have a very low score. Labor has a much higher score, and the Greens and Jackie Lambie have a higher score again. I know there are lots of questions and we've got limited time, but I'm happy to answer questions, and that's just the information about AFTINET, our website where you can donate and how you can contact us. So thanks very much, everyone.
So our next speaker is Steve Murphy, National Secretary of the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, and he'll be speaking on the impact of Trump and political parties' trade policies on manufacturing and workers' rights.
Thank you, Alex. Everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
So I'm Steve Murphy. I'm the National Secretary of the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union. I'll just kick off by expressing solidarity to the elders, leaders and warriors of the traditional owners in the ongoing activism and struggle for justice and self-determination. Also, I want to say thank you to Pat and to AFTINET more broadly for holding this event, and importantly, keeping this issue on the table and lifting and improving our understanding of its importance to working class people all across the country. I've asked to talk for about 10 minutes today, so I'll try and keep within that time frame in order to be able to facilitate this. I'll kick off by saying that the trade union movement more broadly, the AMW, we support global trade. The idea that we would trade goods and services all across our region and around the world to improve people's lives, to improve their opportunities, to create access to health and education, it would be a great outcome. The idea that we might set standards for the way that workers are treated, what workers are paid, and the quality of life that we had would have been, a great thing for us to be able to plan out if we were talking about globalization, where we could abolish poverty and starvation and cure a lot of the things that really are a challenge for workers to be able to get on top of. But trade has not been about that. We've had governments all around the world who have shaped trade in the interests of private capital and have effectively been operating as profit enhancers for private capital for at least the last 3 decades in terms of the policy that's been.
Sorry to interrupt, Steve. Can you just speak up a bit? Some people can't hear you.
Okay. For at least the last 30 years, in terms of the way that Australian trade policy has been rolled out. We've watched as our economy has been exposed to the excesses of global capital. We've evaporated the limited protections that we've had in terms of tariffs and other protections. And the free traders were in boots and all when they started to roll this out, trading away our jobs and our industries for their ideology. And all we got in return as working class people was we traded away all of those jobs, those secure working class jobs, particularly in our regional communities, so that we could, for example, buy a fridge that's $70 cheaper, but only lasts for about 3 years rather than lasting for 20 years. Now, these multinational corporations use that moment to buy up a lot of Australian factories and then export them all around the world, whether the goods that we used to make in Australia, and now all those machineries are in other countries where they're making it. And they did that because the way that trade was shaped and the removal of tariffs with free trade agreements, it encouraged and really the pursuit of exploitation of workers and the environment wherever you could get away from it. And it removed really any of the checks that we had around slavery or of child labor that existed in supply chains. Of course, the world has shifted in the last couple of years. After 30 years of hollowing out our economy, what we've seen is that the cheer squad for free trade has started to get a whole lot more silent now, and they're not saying too much out loud. Australia is the 9th richest economy in the world, but we rank 99 out of 113 in terms of our economic complexity because our industrial capability has been stripped from us, and we're basically a quarry, a farm, and a nice place to visit. We've been seen around the world as a weak negotiator in terms of the way that we approach trade, that we're prepared to trade off anything in order to just get a deal. But we've also got a toothless anti-dumping commission that's not really fulfilling its role and hasn't for many, many years. And the agreements that we're signing have little to no economic benefit for Australia. Now, COVID was a real game changer in terms of the consciousness, because what it did was it exposed all of the fault lines in international trade for all of the world to see, that we were reliant, particularly in Australia, on those international supply chains. And when they were disrupted, we were unable to look after ourselves. We saw that the EU was making decisions about implementing a carbon border adjustment mechanism in terms of driving change around carbon emissions. And we saw a number of countries follow suit, including Japan and Canada, that they were moving that way. And what it signaled was that the dogma of free trade was starting to die away, and countries and leaders were thinking about deeper about what the purpose of globalization and trade should be, but more importantly, in the global race for the jobs of the future, how they were going to trek a path to secure their countries and their people's financial long-term security. Now, we've watched Trump over the last little bit, really like a wrecking ball that's gone through. And if you can figure out exactly what he's trying to do, it could be many, many things. Is this guy suddenly a clever economic manager and looking to use that as leverage? And if you think about what Biden was doing with the Inflation Reduction Act, it was about encouraging investment into America. Well, if this is some clever approach to economic development, it is far more aggressive than what the IFA is. Is this, a leader that is just about attention seeking all around the world, disrupting the world economy so that people pay attention to him to get some leverage on something else? I don't know. Is this just the rich in his ear manipulating world financial markets for their own gain? Possibly. Is it to distract us from something else that is going on in the background so we're paying attention to tariffs rather than other decisions that are made, particularly the American people? It could be the case. Or could this be a bigger free trade agenda that's even more ambitious and more intensely in the interest of private capital? And I think we've got to be open to the mind that this is what Trump's agenda could be, is to disrupt any protections around the world, and to drive us further down the line of unrestricted global free trade. Now, of course, the impact of these tariffs that America is putting on to various countries, but pretty much across the board, I think, except for Russia, is that when those tariff percentages were applied in the right way, the Australian government tried to reach out and see if we could get exemptions for our aluminium, and then secondly for our steel industries. And we knew that that was not going to be the case. It was a pause, but then it was put in place. And we said that that was the right first move to see whether or not we could get their tariffs to not apply to us. But there were two other significant risks for Australia, and that was that if the countries that were currently importing into the US, where those tariffs were imposed, that would reduce the amount that was being consumed by the US economy, they would either look at diverting those products to alternate markets, which would include Australia, given that a lot of those are close to us and our trading partners, or even worse, in order to ensure that they were continuing to keep their factories running for the volume, would simply look to dump those products in countries all around the world. And we needed the federal government to think deeper about not just advocating for reduction or an exemption from tariffs from the president of the United States, but to think about that if products are diverted into Australia, what are we going to do to protect a lot of the industries that are struggling right now, or to protect the industries that are like seedlings trying to grow roots to be able to establish themselves in a where our energy and our industrial needs are changing. So this is an opportunity for Australia to respond to this and to use what is happening in the US and all around the world to reshape the way that we approach and the way that we negotiate around our trading partners. The truth is that relationships between trade ministers matter more than what's in a trade agreement. Those conversations deliver a lot more than what's on the page. We can be critical about free trade agreements, about how particular interest groups manage to get their product on the table. But what we can be confident of is that there's no workers' voices at the table. There's no unemployed people at the table. There's no pensioners at the table. There's no people that are struggling in poverty at the table helping to negotiate these. Is simply in the interest of big private capital and their lobbyists and their mates in Parliament all around the world. And we're saying that we should not play the game that President Trump is suggesting. We should actually change the sport. And we think that there are 5 things that the federal government could do. Some of them are in train that would bed Australia down and protect us largely from the volatility that is happening as part of these decisions. The first one, of course, is to continue to advocate that the metals and the resources that exist on Australian soil, they are our resources, they're our source of wealth, that we should be securing those for domestic use, including their mining, their processing, their smelting, their manufacturing, and their fabrication, particularly given the shift to green metals. It would secure our place in a global supply chain and allow us to solve, if we can get green metals up and operating, solve a lot of the carbon that is happening as part of the smelting process for those metals all around the world. And we suddenly fit into a global supply chain in order to assist countries to meet their Paris commitments in terms of climate action. Secondly, the government could require in all of their tenders, all of their purchases, because government in Australia is one of the biggest spenders in terms of goods and services, is for them to have a requirement on all government projects, all government tenders, that there is a requirement for local content and local manufacturing, with the question to be asked, if we don't make it here, why not? And encouraging local business rather than looking for opportunities to find the cheapest suppliers, but in order to solve a problem, and that is around Australia's sovereign capacity to look after ourselves. Thirdly, is that action on climate change should include supporting our region with the renewable energies that we produce and manufacture, providing them solutions so that they are not kind of left on the shelf and they don't have to find those solutions for themselves, but a new market for us in terms of being the provision of energy for our region. It means that we re-establish relationships in a really positive way, and we become part of the solution rather than part of the problem. The fourth thing that the federal government could do is give our Anti-Dumping Commission some real teeth. They could reallocate the safeguard protections that currently sit in the Productivity Commission, and in the last 20 years, they've only investigated 4 claims of dumping to safeguard our industries, to reallocate that to the Anti-Dumping Commission so that it can be used as a way to stop product from being dumped aggressively into Australia, particularly food and steel and metal products. Secondly, support businesses, local business, to be able to make applications to the Anti-Dumping Commission that are low cost. We're being told that it costs between $150,000 and $200,000 to mount an argument that a product is being dumped in Australia. There's no clear process, there's no clear timeframes, and a lot of industry just give up and just have to cope with dumping, not just of steel and aluminium, but even complex products like water heaters for our homes as well. Thirdly, under the ADC is for the ADC to act to step up and proactively investigate supply chains and act to eliminate exploitation, slavery, and child labour from all of the supply chains, particularly in government contracts. And fourthly is to also consider whether or not there are state subsidies that exist for imported products as well and factor those in. And lastly, we think that government needs to consider what role we play in an increasingly insecure global environment. The relationships that we establish and build on right now will determine what our place is going to be in the world for generations to come. And Australia should be looking at being that peaceful friend, being that positive trading partner, looking at solving problems, and being the leader when it comes to lifting not only our region but our world in terms of what working class people should have access to, and making sure that as the world's energy and industrial needs change, that it's happening in the interest of working class people. So thank you, Pat, for the time, and thanks for coming along.
Thank you, Steve. Our third and final speaker is Sam Cossa-Gilbert, International Program Director at Friends of the Earth, and he'll be speaking on the impact of Trump and political parties' trade policies on the environment and climate change.
Hi, everyone. How you doing? So I'm Sam. I'm from Friends of the Earth. Friends of the Earth is an international environment and social justice organisation. We're based in 73 countries around the world, 5,000 local groups taking action on the most pressing environmental problems, from addressing climate change to deforestation. So yeah, I'm going to be chatting today a little bit about the environment, trade, Trump, and the Australian election. So yeah, let's jump into it. So I wanted to start off. We've got an election coming up, and like Pat, we've got a little scorecard here that's put together by the Climate Council. This is more focused on the climate policies at the election. And with the election front and center, I wanted to really lay out some of the differences between the parties before jumping into Trump and the trade policy. But the way we look at it, I guess the Liberal and quite similar to AFTINET's scorecard as well. We look at the harmful policies for the climate from the Liberal and National Coalition, the Australian Labor Party in the right direction, strong policies from the Greens. And what do we need to address climate change? We need strong science-based targets that reduce emissions, and we see that the coalition has no target for 2030 or 2035, whereas the Labor Party's got a 45% cut and a commitment to net zero by 2050 and some policies to implement that, whereas the Greens have a stronger approach of 75% cut by 2030 and net zero by 2035. In terms of Australia's impact on global climate change, it's not just the emissions that we produce here, but what we export. And that's where it links with the trade component. We are one of the top 4 exporters of and extractors of fossil fuels, together with Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Russia. And if we're going to stop dangerous climate change, we need to stop new coal mines, and we see that the Liberal Party wants to expand gas and weaken approval requirements. The Labor Party doesn't have a plan to phase it out, and the Greens are with no new coal and gas. Another key component of changing and stopping climate change, both here in Australia and abroad, is powering the country with renewable energy. Now, the Liberals are opposing that, and they're pushing for nuclear, which will be sometime in the 2040s, is dangerous and toxic. and not the solution in our mind, whereas the Labor Party is supporting a 83%, 82% target by 2030, and they've got some significant policies to see that implemented. And the Greens are looking at 100% by as soon as possible. So there's a real difference in terms of the parties, and we think it's important with the coming election that people take a stand to address climate change. In terms of Trump, we've heard a bit about his harmful trade policies, but I think it's also he's just been an absolute disaster in terms of the environmental policy in the United States. So he's really taken an axe to the Environmental Protection Agency. There's up to 100 measures to roll back, weaken, and scrap environmental protections. That could be anything from protecting, minimizing air pollution to a mandate for a certain percentage of electronic vehicles to controls on mercury release. So a real whole sway of deregulation. And I think in terms of the political agenda and how this links with trade, we do need to really think about the political element that the corporate free trade ideology has always been pro-deregulation. We're really seeing this now in the US at the national level. They're wanting to have more logging in national forests. They've also cut research. So even things like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency has been gutted, and that does provide basic kind of sampling and testing on the science of climate change and how we know things are changing. There's also been a number of executive orders to increase fossil fuel production. So for the drill, baby, drill. But, you know, we've seen there some of the trade policies are leading to a bit of a tanking of the economy, and the oil price has gone down. So maybe his actual intended, they might shoot themselves in the foot in some ways there. But yeah, they're really trying to use the state, merge the state and the corporate power to support the fossil fuel industry, which will be devastating for our environment. It's been billions of dollars of cuts to environmental programs, from solar on your roof schemes to all range of different environmental programs. And we've got to be really wary again of this kind of reducing of the state, cutting it back, and just the pro-business corporate agenda that we're seeing in the US and people who are trying to transport that over here. And as Pat mentioned, they've withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accords. That's the major international climate accord. So they've withdrawn from that. So yeah, it's been a pretty chaotic trade policy, but also incredibly destructive in terms of the first 100 days, or not even in the environment. So in terms of what does an actual just and sustainable trade policy look like, and the first two speakers mentioned a number of these things, but just to go through it again. So we think solidarity with the global south is important. We do need to recognise different development levels, and there is something included in trade agreements called the special and differentiated treatment. We also think that binding rules on transnational corporations is crucial. They have been the major beneficiary of the neoliberal trade model that Pat and Steve talked about, and we really need to have strong binding rules on them with human rights and environmental standards. At Friends of the Earth, we're working in the United Nations for a new treaty on transnational corporations. But there's also been the European Union's brought in a due diligence law that will regulate corporations weekly, but on their whole supply chain. But yeah, we really need to challenge the power of transnational corporations to have a more just and sustainable trade policy. In terms of other things we can do, I think Pat mentioned this, but we do need human rights and environmental standards for imports. So that could be things like I think it was Rex Patten had the banning had a bill around how to ban products imported where there's been slavery in the supply chain. We've also got some illegal forestry legislation. We really need to strengthen and wind up that sort of legislation. The EU's recently passed another bill on deforestation. So they're not allowing any products linked to deforestation to be placed on their market, whether it be beef or lumber. And there's about 6 or 7 other products. So that sort of regulation, we really got to look at and think about how do we strengthen and ensure that we have good human rights and environmental standards. We can also regulate environmentally damaging exports, and the Australian Institute's done a great job, I think, with some work on a levy on Australia's proposing a levy on Australia's fossil fuel coal exports. So that's an idea to place out there. Also, the Morrison government actually did take some steps in terms of stopping the harmful waste trade around the world. Countries export a lot of plastic waste after we've used it to global south countries that then they have to deal with our problems. So we've taken a few steps here in Australia in dealing with that, but much more needs to be done. There's a number of different loopholes. Another big part of trade in terms of the carbon emissions, around 5% of emissions is from the shipping and aviation, and that's only going to increase. But recently we've had the International Maritime Association organization passed a binding climate agreement. It's a pretty weak one, but it's moving in the right direction. But we really need some strong measures to reduce carbon emissions from shipping and aviation. Around 30% of all emissions or shipping is from the fossil fuel industry, just shipping the fossil fuels around. So hopefully when we're transitioning to a more decarbonised economy, that will get rid of some of those emissions as well. Just want to echo what Steve said around the importance of anti-dumping measures and even specific tariffs to protect local industries where needed, the importance of local content rules and technology transfer. And then lastly, green industrial policy. I think we've really seen this come into the fore in the last few years with the Future Made in Australia Act here in Australia, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. And that's really seeing the government invest much more in specific industries in the decarbonisation process. And for many years, industrial policy has been seen, as not possible and basically horrible under the neoliberal trade model. And it's good to see that some of it's coming back. And we really think that that's important in order for the transition to be just and fair. I think Pat and Steve mentioned already actually probably enough about the kind of nationalist bullying and neoliberal trade policy and those elements, the America alone policy, which they've gone under, and the problems of that. So just, the disturbing impact that it's having, a rapid increase on tariffs, especially on global south partners, is going to lead to massive job losses. I think there are some differences between, the Trump nationalist bullying approach and the neoliberal one, but it's interesting to see that there's a bit of common ground on seeing regulation in the public interest as a barrier to trade, and kind of them coming after the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, or also the food safety standards that we have. So this kind of concept that any public policy that's good for people is a barrier to trade is a bit of a commonality between these two harmful models. I think Pat already mentioned investor-state dispute settlement. We really need to get this out of trade deals. It's a secret corporate court system that allows private companies to sue governments for almost anything that's harmful to their profits. We really need to get that out of the current trade policy. And I think one of the things that's quite harmful about this new approach from Trump is we've seen just a threatening of tariff increases for kind of any action or any progressive action. So recently we had some comrades at the International Maritime Organization climate discussions, and the US had sent a letter to all of the delegates there saying, if you sign this new agreement on the environment, not particularly related, we're going to increase tariffs on you. And this sort of bullying is just not really acceptable. And it's a real threat to global peace and global prosperity. So I think, we need to keep an eye on it. And then lastly, I guess what can we do to stop this? I'd really encourage people on the call to get involved in AFTINET. We've got a few little working groups, one on ISDS, on stopping that. So yeah, get involved in AFTINET. We've got an election coming up, so it's a good idea to vote for just and sustainable candidates. This election will make a big difference, I think, especially, and will have an impact over the global politics. And if we can see a bit of a challenge to Trump or to Trumpism from progressive forces, get involved in the election campaign. I'll be doing the Trades Fall call out this Wednesday night. So yeah, get involved over the last few weeks in the election campaign. I think we need to keep building the links between unions, environment groups, and community members. So yeah, thanks a lot, Pat, and everyone.
Cool. We might leave it there. It is 2 o'clock. Uh, so thank you everyone for coming. And once again, I'd like to thank our speakers and to thank everyone who participated. The AFTINET scorecard that Pat mentioned earlier is now in the chat, so feel free to have a look at that. In the meantime, we also ask you to follow AFTINET on Blue Sky, Facebook, and YouTube. The links of these pages can also be found in the chat now. The election scorecard will have some further circulation in the coming days. So please read and share ahead of the election. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.